The clock struck midnight, and the house was bathed in an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood. I had been half asleep, cocooned in the warmth of my blankets, when Max's barking shattered the quiet. The sound wasn't his usual sharp yip when the mailman arrived, or the excited barks he gave when the neighbor's cat darted across the lawn. This was different, urgent, frantic, and almost pleading. I stumbled to the window, pulling the curtain aside to peer into the backyard. Moonlight cascaded over the garden, illuminating the wooden fence and flower beds. Max was there, just a dark silhouette against the pale grass, barking at something I couldn't see. His body was rigid, tail low, every fiber of his being locked onto a patch of ground near the oak tree. "Max," I hissed, my breath fogging the glass. "What is it?" He didn't turn, didn't so much as flick an ear. His bark echoed again, slicing through the night like a warning. Something about his posture unsettled me, a primal unease stirring deep in my gut. I grabbed a flashlight and threw on a jacket. As I stepped into the backyard, the cold air prickled my skin, sharper than it should have been for autumn. "Max," I called again, softer this time. He whined in response, pawing at the earth with a frantic determination. The flashlight's beam cut through the dark, casting long shifting shadows as I approached him. The garden, usually vibrant with life, felt unnervingly still, the hum of crickets and rustling leaves eerily absent. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath. When I reached Max, I crouched beside him, resting a hand on his trembling back. "What's got you so worked up?" My voice sounded thin against the silence, as though the garden swallowed the words. I aimed the flashlight at the ground he was fixated on. The earth there was oddly uneven, as though it had been recently disturbed. A faint indentation marked the center, like a shallow grave, though no tools had been near this patch of ground for years. Max let out a low growl, his gaze never leaving the spot. My fingers hesitated over the cold dirt, a chill creeping up my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Something was wrong here. I decided to leave the mystery for the morning. "Come on, Max," I murmured, tugging gently at his collar. "Let's go inside." Reluctantly, he followed, his movements stiff and unnatural, as if his instincts were fighting against mine. I locked the door behind us and pulled the curtains tight. Yet even as I lay back in bed, I couldn't shake the image of the disturbed ground, nor the way the shadows had seemed just a little too long. The morning brought a pale, anemic sun that did little to warm the frost-covered garden. Max, usually bounding with energy at dawn, lingered by the door, his ears pressed flat against his head. His unease lingered, matching my own. Clad in a thick sweater and armed with a trowel, I stepped into the backyard, the crisp air heavy with an unshakable stillness. Max stayed inside, watching me through the sliding glass door with wide, worried eyes. The earth was firmer than I expected, but the patch Max had fixated on was indeed softer, the soil looser, darker. I crouched low, pressing the trowel into the dirt. My movements were slow, almost reverent, though I couldn't explain why. It felt wrong to rush, as though the ground itself was resisting, reluctant to give up its secret. After several careful strokes, the trowel hit something solid with a dull thunk. My heart stuttered, and for a moment I simply stared at the dirt, as if expecting it to reveal the object without further effort. I dug around the obstruction, gradually freeing it from the soil. It was a small tin box, its edges rusted and flecked with dirt, but the lid was intact. An intricate pattern of ivy leaves was etched across its surface, faded but unmistakable. I brushed the dirt away, the metal cold and strangely heavy in my hands. Curiosity battled with trepidation as I pried it open. The hinges creaked in protest, the sound jarring against the quiet. Inside, wrapped in a delicate cloth that seemed far too clean for having been buried, was a bundle of objects, a faded photograph, a small brass key, and a piece of folded parchment. The photograph was the first thing I noticed. It depicted a family, a man, a woman, and a child, posed in front of an unfamiliar house. Their expressions were strange, neither smiling nor stern, but somewhere in between. Something about their eyes unsettled me, as though they were looking not at the camera, but at me. The key was unremarkable at first glance, its brass tarnished with age. But as I held it up to the light, I noticed an engraving on the bow, a simple, twisting vine that mirrored the design on the tin. Finally, I unfolded the parchment, my fingers trembling. The words were written in an elegant, looping script that was difficult to read, but the phrase scrawled at the top stood out clearly. "Do not disturb what rests below." A chill prickled the back of my neck, and I glanced over my shoulder instinctively. The garden stretched empty and silent around me, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, a low growl echoed from inside the house. I turned to see Max, his nose pressed against the glass, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "What have I uncovered?" I whispered, clutching the tin tighter as the wind stirred, carrying with it a faint, unfamiliar scent, like old wood and something sweeter, darker, just beneath. The photograph, the key, the ominous warning, I couldn't let them go. That night, the tin box sat on the dining table like an uninvited guest, its contents spread out under the cold glow of a desk lamp. Max lay in the corner of the room, his body tense, and his eyes fixed on the backyard as though expecting something to emerge. I couldn't stop staring at the photograph. The house behind the family was unfamiliar, its outline blurred by age, but its features were eerily reminiscent of mine. The gabled roof, the wraparound porch. It was as if my home had been stripped of its modern updates and captured in sepia tones. I flipped the photo over, hoping for some clue. Written in faded ink on the back was a single word: Ashcroft. It wasn't a name I recognized, but it felt significant, as though it had been waiting for me to find it. The unease settled deeper as I turned my attention to the key. Its vine-like engraving seemed to shimmer under the light, almost as if it were alive. I ran my fingers over it, the cold metal sending a jolt through me. It didn't fit any lock in the house, at least none I could find, but its presence felt heavy with meaning. By midnight, I was no closer to understanding the box's secrets. Exhaustion tugged at me, but sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photograph, the family's faces lingering in my mind like a fading memory. I could almost hear whispers in the silence, just out of reach. Max's low growl pulled me from my thoughts. He was at the door again, his ears flat against his head. I followed his gaze to the backyard, where the oak tree loomed like a sentinel. The disturbed ground seemed darker now, almost as though it were bruised. The house was too quiet. The air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. I checked every lock, closed every curtain, but the feeling of exposure persisted, as though unseen eyes were watching from the shadows. It wasn't until I finally sat down on the couch that I noticed it. The box had been closed. I was certain I had left it open, the objects scattered across the table. Yet there it was, sealed as if it had never been touched. I approached it hesitantly, the sense of unease sharpening with every step. My fingers hovered over the lid, but I didn't open it. The warning on the parchment echoed in my mind. Do not disturb what rests below. Something was stirring. I could feel it. The following morning brought little relief. The sun, though visible, was pale and weak, its light barely penetrating the gloom that hung over the backyard. I avoided the tin box, leaving it untouched on the table, but its presence loomed in my mind. Max refused to step outside, whining and pawing at the door whenever I tried to coax him into the yard. Even the cat, who typically wandered the house with an air of detached superiority, had taken to sitting in the kitchen window, her gaze locked on the oak tree. She didn't blink. She didn't move. By afternoon, her behavior had grown stranger still. She'd hiss at nothing, her fur bristling as her green eyes followed invisible shapes in the air. At one point, I found her crouched low near the tin box, her ears flattened and her body taut like a coiled spring. "What is it?" I whispered, as though she might answer. She hissed once more before darting into another room, leaving me alone with the heavy silence. It was then that I decided to take a closer look at the oak tree. There had to be a reason for the unease, the disturbed ground, the animal's reactions. Armed with a spade and a flashlight, I stepped into the backyard, the cold air wrapping around me like a shroud. The oak tree's twisted branches clawed at the sky, casting shadows that seemed to writhe like living things. The disturbed patch of earth was darker than the surrounding soil, as though it had been stained. As I knelt and pressed the spade into the ground, I felt a resistance, not from roots or rocks, but something else. The flashlight flickered, its beam trembling like a heartbeat. The deeper I dug, the stronger the feeling of wrongness became, as though I were peeling back layers of something sacred and forbidden. Then I hit it. Another object. It wasn't metal this time, but wood. Old, rotted, and splintered. I cleared away the dirt, revealing what appeared to be the corner of a small wooden chest. Its edges were lined with rusted nails, and a faint emblem was burned into the lid, the same ivy pattern as the key. As I traced the outline of the emblem, a faint breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the faintest whisper, like leaves brushing against one another. But the sound wasn't natural. It was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like a voice speaking just out of range. The cat let out a yowl from inside the house, her cry sharp and startling. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a rising wind. I had unearthed something, but I wasn't sure I wanted to see it. The chest seemed to hum under my fingers, as though it were alive. Backing away, I left it partially uncovered, the soil piled around its edges like a makeshift grave. As I returned to the house, I felt a gaze pressing into my back, heavy and cold. When I turned to look, the oak tree stood silent, its branches motionless. But the shadows beneath it seemed darker, deeper, alive with a quiet, watching presence. The night came too quickly, swallowing the house in a heavy silence that felt as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I couldn't stop thinking about the wooden chest, half buried beneath the oak tree, as if the earth was reluctant to let it go. The tin box on the table seemed to echo its presence, a quiet menace that lingered no matter how far I moved from it. Max growled softly from his spot near the door, his gaze fixed on the backyard. The cat had returned to her perch on the windowsill, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, unblinking as she watched the oak tree. The house felt alive, its stillness charged with an oppressive weight that pressed against my chest. Unable to ignore the pull any longer, I retrieved the key from the tin box and stepped into the night. The backyard was bathed in pale moonlight, the oak tree's branches stretched like skeletal fingers against the sky. The unearthed chest glinted faintly, the exposed wood appearing darker, as though soaked in shadow. As I knelt before it, the whispers began again, soft and unintelligible, curling through the air like smoke. They seemed to rise from the chest itself, a faint hum that vibrated through the key in my hand. The lock was rusted but intact, the faint imprint of the ivy design mirroring the key's engraving. My hands trembled as I inserted the key, its cold metal sending a shiver up my arm. For a moment I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to stop. But the whispers grew louder, urging me forward, pulling me into their rhythm. The lock clicked with a sound that was far too loud, echoing unnaturally in the still night. I pushed the lid open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest, and the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it felt deafening. Inside was a single object wrapped in layers of brittle, yellowed cloth. I unwrapped it carefully, my breath hitching as the final fold revealed an old journal bound in cracked leather. Its surface was embossed with the same ivy pattern, but the edges were blackened, as though it had been licked by flames. The moment I touched it, the whispers returned, stronger now, their cadence sharper, almost insistent. I flipped open the journal to the first page, where a single line of spidery handwriting greeted me. We buried the memory to keep it safe, but its roots will always grow. My stomach turned as I scanned the subsequent pages. They were filled with detailed accounts of strange phenomena, shadows that moved independently, voices that spoke without bodies, and dreams that seemed to come alive. The entries grew more frantic with each page, the handwriting devolving into desperate scratches that barely formed words. The final entry stopped me cold. Ashcroft is not a place, but a pact. The roots run deeper than we feared. It watches from the tree. A sudden gust of wind stirred the air, rattling the branches above me. I looked up, and my heart lurched. The oak tree seemed closer, its twisted limbs reaching down like claws. The shadows beneath it moved, shifting in a way that defied logic, coiling and writhing like living things. The journal slipped from my hands as a deep, resonant creak echoed through the night. It wasn't the sound of branches swaying in the wind, but something deeper, older, as though the tree itself were groaning awake. The whispers rose into a crescendo, words tumbling over one another in a language I couldn't understand. The air around me grew colder, heavier, the smell of damp earth and decay filling my nostrils. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the shadows stretched toward me, dark tendrils creeping over the ground. From the house, Max barked furiously, his cries muffled by the walls. I turned and ran, the whispers chasing me, their voices sharp and accusing. Inside, I slammed the door shut, locking it against the unseen presence outside. Max pressed against my legs, trembling, while the cat hissed from her perch, her fur bristling. The house groaned, its timbers creaking in protest, as though it, too, were alive and reacting to what I had disturbed. The tin box sat untouched on the table, its surface gleaming faintly under the flickering kitchen light. The photograph lay beside it, the family's faces now more vivid, their eyes more focused, directed at me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with Max at my feet and the journal in my lap, its pages vibrating faintly under my fingers. The whispers outside faded with the first light of dawn, but the air remained heavy, the oak tree's shadow lingering long after the sun rose. The journal offered no solutions, only warnings. Whatever had been buried beneath the tree was not meant to be unearthed. Its roots ran deep, tangled in the foundation of the house, the land itself. As I sat there, the tin box caught my eye once more, its ivy design seemingly shifting under the light. A realization settled over me, cold and final. Some secrets are meant to remain hidden, their roots intertwined with the past, impossible to sever. The oak tree stood silent outside, but its presence was unmistakable. It wasn't just watching, it was waiting,